everybody, and welcome to Randy Sands and the Mediumship Crew. Tonight, we are blessed to have Charvonne Carlson Carlson. That's a tongue twister. With us, and we are going to go over some spiritual pioneers because it's the third Monday of the month, and that's what we do the third Monday of the month. And Charvonne, what I'm going to do is, honey, I am just going to give you the floor and let you do your thing.
All right. Thank you.
And
Thank you. Thank you.
thank you for joining us and sharing your knowledge.
I'm really excited. I'm glad that you guys are here to hear me talk about so far, two of my favorite people. My favorite people keep changing as I research. So I'm very fickle that way. So, but right now I'm all in the group with Reverend Bertha Crear and Reverend Nellie Mae Taylor. I've decided I'm going to start with Reverend Bertha Crear because it's going further back. And then Nellie Mae comes in, like a little bit more modern history, if you want to call it that. So Reverend Bertha Crear was actually, her maiden name is Smith, was born September 5th, 1878. And she transitioned on May 12th, 1927. So quick math, which I don't do, it's somewhere in her 40s. And I actually have a picture, which I should have pulled down beforehand. Hold on. When I found a picture of her, I was all excited. I'm like a kid in the candy store. But here, I don't know. Yeah, there we go. So that is Miss Reverend Bertha Crear. Um, the dress she's wearing, for those that were here before we started recording, I'm all about sewing and everything. So that is an actual velvet uh, dress. That dress is made out of velvet cotton, and it's very thick and heavy, and it's not lined, but lining was expensive in that time frame. So yeah, so that's just another geek. But at any rate, Reverend Bertha Crear was born in South Charleston, Ohio, to a mother named Berelia Hines and her father named Wilson Smith, who were born in Kentucky. And the thing about it is this is 1877 that she's born, so this is post the Civil War, but her parents were born in the Civil War and migrated from Kentucky to Ohio. And this isn't an uncommon thing to happen. Post the Civil War, this is one of the, I'd say about three migrations that African Americans, Black Americans do from the South to the North, because when slavery ends, you got to find work. You've got to figure out how you're going to pay your bills. You're going to figure out how you're going to feed yourself, feed your kids. And some people are done working on the farm, because you're forced to do it. Doesn't mean that you want to do it. So for those who had probably had relatives who went north first, told them about, oh, you can get a job here, you can do different stuff, you don't have to pick cotton, you don't have to be, in the fields. If you don't want to, you could try other trades. That was very appealing and attractive to a lot of African Americans post the Civil War. So they would migrate north, and Kentucky, the Kentucky Ohio, what I call migration highway, is a very common one, and it wasn't just for African Americans. There were also white Americans that also did that trek. Um, so and and part of the reason why was because they did carve a highway so that at holidays they could drive back down or take the train back down to go visit family that didn't make the trip north. And back and so it was a back and forth. It was a good spot. I'm Just a little background of why I understand all that is because I also do ancestry research and I research genealogy. And so in my family tree, I don't personally have any relatives right now from Kentucky, but I understood that particular migration and how that migration happened between Kentucky and Ohio. Anyway, so when her parents moved from Kentucky to South Charleston, turns out her mother was a medium, and she became a very popular medium in that area of Ohio. Her father dies at some point pre 1896, and then about 1900 is where I see her again in the census with her mom. She's living with her mom. And at this point, she's already divorced from her first husband. But she lists herself as widowed. Now, that also isn't an uncommon thing to do, to put yourself as widow in the census, as opposed to divorced. My personal story, my great grandmother had my great grandfather dead the entire time she lived in New Jersey. He wasn't dead, but she told every time she did the census or talked to anybody, she was a widow. She wasn't a widow. But that was because when you are a widow status, you get to be able to establish your own, you get to kind of dictate how you move further into society. You're not expected to get a new husband. You're not expected to give everything over. You get a little bit more freedom because you're a widow. So that makes sense. In this time period, in between like 1900 and 1910 is when her mother is working full time as a medium, psychic healer. And there's this ad in the paper of her mom, beautiful picture of her mother, and a full, discussion of how she is the best person to go to if you need help with your life, present, past, or future. Nothing to be scared of. She's very professional. She was born with a double veil at birth, so she was blessed. That's how come she is so talented, and so on and so forth. So that gave me the clue that that's why Rev Bertha Crear would eventually become a spiritualist and be a medium in spiritualism, because she grew up in a household with a mother who was already doing this. So it would make sense to me that if she also had any of that talent or gifts, that she would follow in that footsteps going forward. So in 1900s, where she was married, she's divorced, she marries again to a Alexander Greggs. And here is where the newspaper articles will show her as Bertha Greggs. And here is where you'll find her beginnings into spiritualism, being a part of the National Spiritualist Association, where she is serving different NSA churches. She's attending the conventions. She is bringing in more people into the religion, especially people of color. She's really making her name for herself in the NSA and in spiritualism in Ohio at the time. And then from there, as she continues to grow, she gets divorced again. Gotta love her.
You mean
She gets
widowed?
divorced. No, she's divorced. This time she's not doing the widow thing. This time she was honest. She's like, divorced. So I believe I think I'm on husband number 2. I lost count. I kind of lose count. So she then marries again in 19, and I have to look at my notes because I don't memorize dates very well. So she marries again. So she married Greggs in 1911. Then she marries Charles Crear, that would be the last husband, in 1918. Charles Crear, it would be the husband that she actually, that's where it really takes off for her. He started off as just a porter, doing odd jobs. She was moving in the spiritualist community, getting to know the different spiritualists, churches in her area. She then eventually starts her own church in 1916 called the Christian Spiritualist Church, and she's the pastor. But one of the things that was really exciting about a lot of the articles I read on her in the Ohio papers was that whenever she would serve, she would get somewhere between 100 to 200 people to show up to hear her do her readings.
That's impressive.
She was a phenomenal medium.
Very impressive.
very, I mean, especially for that time frame. Um, as she's moving up. And so now she's a part of the greater organization. And they love her. The NSA loves her. She is one of 4 missionaries at the time, and this is in the 1920s, early, like 1918, 1920s, where she gets the missionary status. They assign her as a missionary. She actually is one of 4 people who are sent to the International Spiritualist Congress that happened in 1922 in London. And they made a big deal about it in the paper. She's going. I actually have her passport, her application for her passport with her picture in there, and it still looks like a mugshot. I'm telling you, they never stopped making those passport pictures look like a mugshot. They've been doing it forever. And then, of course, the return trip, documentation of her return trip, where she traveled from Liverpool, got on the boat, came into Quebec, and then came on into the United States. That same year is also the same year that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, after the Congress, comes to the United States as well. What I found interesting about this, and why I bring up Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, what I find interesting is that, number one, he wrote his itinerary and what he did while he was in the United States, and then gave it to the newspapers, and they published it in full. Now, I thought that was kind of fascinating because I'm used to reporters going to report and then they write up an article about the report. He wrote the report for them, and then all they did was publish it. And then I was like, you go, dude. Talk about controlling your message. So in this report, and it's a few, and they gave him a big space. So he had a few columns for this particular report. He talks about one part of the report. He talks about Negroes and spiritualism. That's the term that's used back then. And he's like, part of his goal while he was here in the United States was to talk to as many Negroes as he could come across during his travels. Now, when he toured the United States, he toured it on the train. And he had issues with that. That's a whole nother story. But he toured it on the trains. And on the trains, you had the porters, the waiters, the bellhops, the people who took care of you, the people who fed you were almost always African Americans at this time. And he would ask them about what they thought about spiritualism. Did they even know about it? Are they interested in being spiritualists? And he's like, and I found that they were very, very interested. And I let them know that Reverend Bertha Crear was a great resource for them for coming into the spiritualist movement. So that was really exciting to me. It's like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, in his book that he wrote to tell people about his journey, mentions her in his article part. So that shows that there was an interrelationship, that she didn't just go to London and sit in the back and watch. She was an integral part of that Spiritualist Congress. Also, it's the same year. So here's where things get super exciting and super sad. I know, it's just the way I like it. So that year, she is selected by the NSA to be one of the representatives to go to London for the International Spiritualist Congress and for International Congress of Spiritualists, which is now the ISF, the International Spiritualist Federation. So that's that transition. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle that year travels to the US, giving his thoughts about spiritualism and how to, grow it in the US. When she's at that Congress, she is well received. They love her. She also takes the exam and passes and becomes the first American to receive a diploma for message bearing in the international, the SNU, basically, the Spiritualist National Union. That was huge. She was not only the first American, she's the first Black woman, she's the first Black American, she's just the first. So she got it that same year at that Congress. And now she is an international medium at this point, because she also served while she was over there. And she was on the same stage. There's this huge article on it. It's gorgeous. She's on the same stage with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and many other well-known at the time British spiritualists and mediums. When she comes back to the US, she's coming back on a high, in my opinion. Her church is successful. She's well loved. She was well received overseas. She's a faithfully committed to being a part of the NSA. She's a missionary, and she started from these humble beginnings. And here she is, really expanding with her spiritualism. The reason why I bring up her husband, though, and I'm going to go back to Crear for a moment. Crear at this point also is having his own success. So he goes from being a porter and a bellhop and working different jobs to training and ended up having one of the well-established African-American funeral homes. And to explain why that's important is because during that time frame, African Americans had a hard time finding anyone to bury them with the respect and honor and love that they would like to receive, or finding anyone to bury them, period, because they were Black. And, there's still that divided racial segregation. So one of the things was that African Americans, mostly men, because it's still a male-dominated world and got that male mentality, started creating funeral homes, becoming embalmers, becoming funeral directors, actually opening up the businesses, which then creates a middle class and offering life insurance to other Black Americans so that they can bury their loved ones and get life insurance so they can afford to bury their loved ones and so on. So then it creates this Black middle class. And this happens around the entire country in that time frame. So this is not just isolated to Ohio. This is something that happens throughout the Midwest, the North, the East. It becomes a way for African Americans to establish themselves and kind of create a footing for themselves, coming from slavery into establishing themselves for themselves in the country. And spiritualism, at least in Ohio, I'm not going to say it wasn't anywhere else, but I know of Ohio. Spiritualism, because there was an article, and I actually read this article today, the spiritualists in the NSA, in the TNS, actually, it's in the summit, where there's a part that says, while Reverend Bertha Crear's church hasn't really grown, we've noticed that there's a growing interest in spiritualism from Black men, businessmen, the funeral home, the funeral circuit. And that was like, oh, that kind of makes sense. Funerals, funeral home, embalmers, tie it with the churches. So what's happening is that they're also needing to find churches that will do the ceremonies and do the last rites and pray over their loved ones when they transition, when they're doing the funerals, having that connection with the growing number of colored men, as they call them, having businesses in the funeral industry also gives them an opportunity to expand the congregation and the members into the association. And Bertha Crear sits there with her husband and right in that nexus, right in that sweet spot, so to speak. So besides being an incredible medium, besides being devoted and dedicated to spiritualism, besides becoming an international medium, she also kind of brings some money to the table, or brings people to the table to help keep the organization established. So 1922, all this comes around for her. She is just, I'm certain she's on cloud nine. She started from humble beginning. Here she is in what she loves, she's passionate about. And October, and then she's mentioned by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in the papers across the country. This is national news, and her name is in there. And then October 1922 is the beginning of the Negro question. Should we have a separate spiritualist association for colored people, specifically Black people? And the reason why I say specifically Black, because it wasn't about, colored at the time covered Asian, Hispanic, Indigenous, multiracial. It covered everybody who was not white. They were focused on the Black spiritualist and that separation. And this question comes to the table the same year she comes back. And she's and I feel like there must have been like a feeling of a gut punch. You know, she comes to the convention, she's so excited, she's with her people, she can't wait to share all the things that she learned overseas, her first trip ever out of the country. And well, the Negro problem, we've got to fix this because we're being denied access to certain venues because we have colored spiritualists and Black spiritualists in our midst. It started in, what was it, the big hotel, Four Seasons, I think it was, in New York, really wanted to kick the spiritualists out from having their convention there because they had Black people as a part. Reverend Bertha Crear being, actually, she was one of the centerpieces of that, where she agreed to stay in the room of one of her counterpart that went to England with her as the missionary. She agreed to stay in the room and be written as her personal attendant and sleep on the floor. They weren't allowed to use the front entrance. They had to use the back entrance if they wanted to come into the convention. I mean, just that whole dehumanizing way of treating people because their skin color is different. But Bertha Crear never let it distract her. She's like, well, this is what we do. Maybe we just don't go back to that place. We go to other places. But there was a couple different things that the NSA wanted to bring in during that time, because there was a lot of issues going on at that time beyond the Negro problem. There was this kind of shift with the way we thought about spiritualism, from more of that open, we're all one, we're working together, we're going to grow together, to more of an isolated, wanting to fit in, be able to go where we want to go and be able to show how we're just as legitimate as the Baptists and the Catholics and pick a denomination. And also what was interesting is that the board of directors pictures of the national board, Seattle National Board that year, were all white men, middle class, from the same social economic background. And I about went, oh, that's what happened. That right there, that complete lack of diversity in that moment explained kind of, and they're all thinking alike because there's nothing challenging their thoughts. It's an echo chamber, basically. They've created an echo chamber for themselves. And while they probably meant well and they probably didn't mean it that way, and maybe that's not how they really felt, or whatever, because it's an echo chamber, they have nothing to, they're all working together and they're all thinking alike, so to speak, because there's no diversity in the room to say, hey, wait a second, that's stupid. Or no, we shouldn't do that. Because there were other things that they were trying to do as well. I mean, that is the time where they come up with the idea that we shouldn't have more than one church per 100,000 people population. And this is before we're the NSAC. This is when we're NSA. And at this point, NSA is a bunch of home circles and different local chapter associations, state associations. You know, there's just a conglomerate of people under the umbrella of the NSA. And they're looking to streamline it and kind of make it more acceptable and more uniform in their thought process. And to weed out the competition. This is also when they start discussing whether or not any independent spiritualists were allowed to speak on their platform, and whether or not any NSA spiritualists could speak on independent spiritualist platforms. So there's this, so it's all falling in line. And at the time, I'm sure they thought this was a great, and you can kind of see the thinking behind it. But again, when everybody's the same, you don't have anybody to come in and bring in that independent thought, like let's go a little bit more critical thinking here, or from my position in life or my life experiences, this is what it sounds like. Is that really what you're trying to say? I digress. However, 1923, they ordain her. And there's a huge ad taken out in the paper about her ordination, a beautiful picture of her, and the what's his name? There's the pastor. The two people that she went with to London are part of her ordination and giving her her credential as an ordained. So she becomes an ordained minister for the NSA in 1923. It's absolutely, I mean, this ad is, oh my God, I love it. It's absolutely beautiful. They talk about how she's an international and national medium. She is a committed and dedicated believer in spiritualism, the best person to go to, and all and on, and how much she has contributed and brought to the National Spiritualist Association, and just all of this love, outpouring of love for her in 1923. So that was just so fantastic. So 1925, because they're still having the Negro question, her and Mercy Catawba, oh God, I can't say her last name, the sea lady.
Walder.
Yeah, sure. Her and Mercy, along with a few other people, surrendered their credentials. Because at that point, they realized that the Negro question they were serious. They're going to they're going to push out the colored people the Black people out of the spiritualists to go into their own spiritualist association, which later becomes the National Spiritualist Colored Association, the National Colored Spiritualist Association of Churches. The thing with Reverend Bertha Crear, she was never a fan of it. She had no intentions of joining it. It wasn't happening. She wasn't interested, and you weren't going to make her. So she chose to just surrender her credentials and just keep running her church back home. And I actually looked up where her church was, which is now a parking lot or highway or something. Her church and her husband's funeral home were like around the street from each other, and her house was down the street from her church and the funeral home. And it was like a really small community. So she kept working out of her church until she transitions in 1927. They still report in the local African American newspapers about her services. She's still running a weekly service with classes. She's still reaching out and still working as a message bearer. They called them message bearers back then. Now we call them mediums. 1927, when she transitions, just kind of, she transitions because of fibroids. So if anybody has any experience with that, and because I had the same thing, I had the fibroid tumors, where the fibroids affect everything, and it's a mess, and it's painful. And if you can hold off till menopause, you can avoid the surgery that you would need to have to just end the pain, because it's painful. It's a very painful process. But this is 1920s, and my guess is that medical technology is not where it is now. So she goes into shock in the middle of surgery from the loss of blood. And because what they were doing was giving her a hysterectomy and pulling out the fibroids. And she just never woke up again off the table. The final piece I wanted to add, which I thought was really fascinating, was sorry. Someone had a question?
Tammy, did you want to say something? You're on mute.
You're muted.
How do you spell Bertha's last name so I can look her up?
Crear.
Crear.
hmm The best way to look her up is to go to newspapers.com, create an ancestry tree on her, and because there's no mainstream books or writings on her. There is the one website that in Ohio, I think it's a Cleveland, Ohio. I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me. That does have the picture and like a short synopsis about her contributions in that area.
You
All
know,
right.
if
Mandy?
you want to send that to me, when I put it up on YouTube, I'll include that in the description
Great.
in
Okay,
case
I will
anybody
totally
wants to
send
see
it
it.
to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And see her picture better than what I can show you on the computer screen. Um, Now, a couple interesting things about her that I loved was one, she was when her brother wanted to get married, she had to write off consenting that he could get married because her mother had transitioned. Now, mind you, he was 19. Don't really need permission to get married at 19, but for whatever reason, she had to sign the document saying, I give my consent that he can get married. I thought that was cool. The other thing is after she transitioned, a woman who really loved her in her church, who had transitioned, had left $1,000 for her church, of which 100 of it or something like that was to go directly to Bertha Crear. Now, she's already transitioned; she's not going to get the money. But $1,000 in 1929 is a lot of money. And they were trying to contest it, but they couldn't contest it, so they had to actually give her church that $1,000 donation. That was, to me, was a reaffirming validation of just how important she was in that community as a spiritualist teacher, missionary, medium, and a member of the NSA. And even the NSA and the TNS on the year she died wrote a beautiful description of all of her services and how grateful they were for the work that she did and what she brought to spiritualism during that time. So she was really well loved and well known and did amazing work. The backlash against the end of slavery got in the way. So, questions before I move on to Nellie Mae. Questions,
Actually,
comments?
actually, we're going to do questions. And what I'm going to ask you, if you'd be willing to
Okay.
do, because I
Yeah.
love this and I love you, girl. This has been amazing. We're going to run out of time to do Nellie this time. Would you be willing to come in
Sorry.
the third Monday of next month? No, it's perfect.
Sure.
It's been a great amount of information. Would you be willing to
I
come in the
would love
third Monday?
to.
Oh,
Oh,
fabulous.
yeah.
And we'll do Nellie Mae then.
Okay.
Um,
No problem.
Before we get to questions, I have to tell you that this has been very touching to me. A lot of people don't know, but I was raised with a family of 11 black kids, and I witnessed what they went through in the 70s. So to imagine what this young lady went through way back then is it's huge. It's very huge. And it says a lot about her character that she had the determination and the tenacity to follow her dreams and to make it happen and to be accepted. And I think that that is absolutely spectacular.
hmm hmm it's even more spectacular to me because I'm guessing that the education was probably not very high, especially for Black children after post the Civil War. Her parents weren't educated; they were born into slavery, so they couldn't read or write, and that's something they probably learned afterwards. So that's I can't, and I think to myself, if I couldn't read or write, just that, right? Like I take that for granted that I could read or write, take it completely for granted. But the thought of not being able to read or write and having to learn that as an adult had to have been absolutely scary, and had in itself is just an incredible feat. And then of course dealing with racism and segregation and all of the other isms that jump in. And of course being able to get married 3 times.
It's all quite impressive. It's spectacularly impressive in my mind.
Mhm, mhm.
Anybody have any questions or thoughts they'd like to share? Yes, Stacy.
Did she do any work with her mom being a medium, together or?
I haven't found anything, but I'm not going to say no. She does reference her mom during the ordination piece where they actually quote her for saying, I was told 27 years ago that this is where I would end up, and here I am. And I'm pretty certain that the person that told her that 27 years ago was her mother.
Stacy,
I
do
know.
you have something?
Well, yes, I have Charvonne at my fingertips, but I'll ask too because I want to know how long did the church go on? Because I actually find it fascinating that her husband's an undertaker or a funeral director, or whatever you want to say.
Mhm.
So, come on, you can't have a medium as a wife. So I'm sure there was a lot of communication. A lot of communication. But do you know how long the church survived after her passing? Like, was there any, was she
See,
teaching others?
so what I'm gathering before they paved it over, I'm going to, and it's, the church was around at least until 1929 because of the donation from, or the not the donation, the inheritance that she received from the woman that transitioned. So she was around at least till 1929. I believe somewhere in the 1930s. This is now, remember, we're also talking about Depression era as well. So, but I believe somewhere in the 1930s is when they go in and flatten wherever they could flatten. So I'm going to guess that her church lasted until about, and it's a guess, but I know it was at least till 1929 after she passed, if not into the 1930s. I have not seen when they talk about her church, because I have been pulling up the ads for her church to see if there was another pastor for that church, and I haven't found another pastor for that church.
Do you know the exact location? Could you imagine going there and standing in that spot, the energy?
Yeah, I have the address.
That would be amazing.
I also have a picture of her house. Post COVID, this is my goal to go stand in those spots.
I'm
Yeah,
telling you.
totally, Randy. You heard me. You heard me.
We're going. We're going.
We're going. Yeah, that's totally my goal. My goal is to be in that space and be in that energy. But Stacy and Joanne, that is, remember when I sent you about the church that they're going to knock down that was also built? He was an integral part of how I found him was because of her. They worked together closely that whole time. So, and part of when you do research, so just a little bit about research, especially with geology research, there's the fan. So when you research the person and you hit a dead end, you start researching their family, associates, and neighbors, because they may also have information that would bring them in, which is how I found the ad for her ordination, because they wrote her name on her picture, but when you're scanning documents, they're only looking for words in the actual text. So his name was in the text, and his name was Boylster. See, I can't pronounce that either. Um, but his name was in the text part, and so when that article came up, I was like, "Oh my God, it's her ordination!" And that's why that article came up, because they don't mention her at all in her name in the text when they did the write up. So I know that those two churches were actually near each other. Her church and his church were like near each other. He worked her church, she worked his church. She helped a lot of churches get started in the Cleveland area, a lot of them, because of her power as a medium. She drew in large groups of people every time she would go work their church. So they would make sure that she had people like Reverend Bertha Greggs and Reverend Bertha Crear, or, depending on which year we're looking at, is serving so-and-so's church, or served, and 100 people showed up, and we had 20 people sign up to be spiritualists, and, and so on.
Does anybody else have any questions? No? All righty then. Well, that was spectacular. I am like just in awe right now of this lady, and would love to know even more about her. And yes, we're going to have to go to that spot. We're going to have to
It'll
go,
be
girl.
fun. It's going to be fun.
Yes, it will. So what I'd like to do is I would like to say good night to everybody. Jack, would you like to say good night to everybody?
Night, everybody.
Jack, what
Good
happened
night.
to good happy
Thank
people?
you, Charvonne.
Good night, good, happy people.